Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon again for our next to the last session of our, I think what's been a terrific course anyway, celebrating Enchanted England. Today we're going to examine what it means to be English in the 20th century. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Harleen Singh, who is an assistant professor of literature and women's studies at Brandeis University. Please join me in welcoming Harleen Singh for a fascinating look at who is English, colonial subjects, post-colonial immigrants, and literature.
Lois, for a very generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me again here. Were many of you there in the spring when I gave the lectures on India? Yes, yes? Oh, we're old friends then. No problem. Excellent. If you were there during the spring when I gave the lectures on India, in some ways you may have some sense of what I'm alluding to here when I'm going to talk about who is English, because really the talk in some ways, I mean, if you've glanced at your handout as you've come in, you'll notice that the bullet points I have there trace a kind of international trajectory of Britishhood, of what it means to be English, but in the context of the world, so to speak. And some people can even argue that, in fact, who is English and what is English has been constructed in a far more international way than we often understand from as far back as the Tudors. In any case, so the premise of the talk looks at what it means to be English, but what it means to be English in the framework of the world, and also takes as its assumption that personal and national identity is not a monolith. It is, in fact, flexible, it's constructed, and it is continually being reinvented as we go along. Thus, what I want to offer today is some discussion on what and whom we consider English and why that is a rather fraught question, at least in the present globalized moment. So I just want to begin by reading a little bit from Daniel Defoe's The True-Born Englishman. It's on your handout, and I've always loved this. Of course, if you know anything about Defoe, writing in the 18th century, you know that he follows the form of satire. All of this is very satirical writing, and Defoe is known as a very famous writer of satire. Thus from mixture of all kinds began that heterogeneous thing, an Englishman, in eager rapes and furious lust begot, betwixt a painted Briton and a Scot, whose gendered offspring quickly learnt to bow and yoke their heifers to the Roman plough, from whence a mongrel half-bred race there came, with neither name nor nation, speech or fame, in whose hot veins now mixtures quickly ran, infused betwixt a Saxon and a Dane, while their rank daughters to their parents just received all nations with promiscuous lust. This nauseous brood directly did contain the well-extracted blood of Englishmen. So if you look at this, which is printed, it's Defoe's satire printed in 1701, this notion of who is English is not a new question. The idea that we think about it now in our present globalized and in some ways virtual world where everything is so very close and so within reach, that we consider these enmeshing and collapsing of national and international boundaries and racial boundaries sometimes to be a thing of the present moment, very modern, very much part of our globalized transnational moment. But in fact, this is a very, very old question, going back so far as the 18th century. And in some ways, this precedes the chatter, the talk that leads to the Act of Union in 1707, from where England joins Scotland, Wales, and many other parts of the nation and becomes the United Kingdom. So what we think sometimes as natural, United Kingdom, all of these things, except, you have the Welsh, you have the Scots, etc., but of course it's all England, it's all the United Kingdom. And in fact, United Kingdom is a construct. It's just as many modern nations of the world, it is a construct that came about in 1707 with the Act of Union. And this is something important to keep in mind. And as we go through this talk, we'll go back and forth between politics, some history, and the reason why literature is so important, bless you, in thinking about these things together. Okay. So 1707, the early 18th century, England becomes the United Kingdom. And of course, from now on, we also know, and those of you who know your history will know, of course, that when King James of Scotland became King James VI of England after the death of Elizabeth I, the Tudors died and then the Stuarts came in, that, in some ways these relationships and these mixtures of royal lines had been going on for many years. But in 1707, with the Act of Union, for the first time, territorial boundaries were redefined. And from England, you get the United Kingdom. In 1776, I don't need to probably explain to this room what happened. And in 1776, with the breakdown of the British Empire in the Americas, right? A breakdown which, in that part of the 18th century, until then, the American colonies did not really redefine British citizenship or Britishhood or Englishness in any substantial way, in the sense that most of the ways in which the colonies were being governed, the ways in which slave populations and native populations were being treated, did not really pose a threat to British citizenship or to Britishhood, but it also didn't change the notion of what it meant to be British in any substantial way. However, 1776 and the troublesome rascals called Americans, as many British writers put it in the 18th century, this troublesome group called the Americans, broke away and the United States came about. And this really necessitated a change of the British imperial compass, because until now, all the energies of the British Empire had in many ways been focused on the Americas as their richest and most bountiful colonies. But once the Americas were lost, it became imperative for the British to start looking elsewhere to really rebuild their empire. And so we often think about British colonialism or British imperialism and say Africa and India as natural allies, as natural partners in this group of people. But in fact, it was a very deliberate move after American independence, which resulted in the British Empire in India and in Africa. So until the Americas were there, actually England didn't really have much need to look elsewhere. So after American independence, you of course then have the Caribbean, which is close by, and the British have a lot of colonies in the Caribbean. And there's slave labor, which is brought to run the colonies, just as in the United States. But there's also indentured labor that's brought in. Now, what happens between 1776 and the 1830, slavery is abolished in Europe by Britain. Slavery is abolished by Britain. And so, of course, I'm sure some of you have seen Amistad and the great scene of the British ship actually blowing up the slave fort, which is all true. The British were, guarding the seas, policing the seas for slave labor. The Americans were all bad. The British were very good and in the forefront of human rights here, except that they had a backdoor. And the backdoor was that they still had plantations in the Caribbean, and they needed labor to run these plantations, which they could no longer get from Africa. So they began to look towards India. And what they used was an old system of Indian serfdom, right, which is the system of indentured labor, indentured servitude. And this was a kind of backdoor entry because it wasn't slave labor. You didn't own people. You had a contract with them, right? And it wasn't British because, of course, it was built on the Indian feudal system, so they were just using what was already there in India and getting labor for their own colonies. Does that seem clear enough, right? So what happened is that from the early 19th century, they began to export hundreds of thousands of people from India as indentured servants. Now, the contract of indentured servitude was that basically you signed a bond, your family got a certain amount of money, and you bonded yourself into labor for the British company at that point in time. And so you could, once you were bonded as labor, you had to serve wherever they took you to serve. So indentured servants from India went to the Caribbean, went to Africa. So places like, even South America, so places like Suriname, Guyana have sizable Indian populations to this day. Fiji, as far out as Fiji even. So you began to see this great population move to the Caribbean. And, as you can imagine, the passage by sea from India to the Caribbean could not have been an easy one. It took months to get there. And for most people, they had to serve close to 10 to 15 years of indentured servitude before they had actually fulfilled their bond. After 10 to 15 years of being in this place, to which it had taken them 3 to 4 months or 6 months to get, new kinds of allegiances, new kinds of alliances, new kinds of families had been formed. And many of these Indian servants or labor knew that there was no place for them back in India. And so you began to see a population grow in the Caribbean of Indian indentured servants, right, who even after they were free began to live there. And that is why in the Caribbean to this day, you have this mixture of people, the native Caribbean who were once there, the Arawaks who were wiped out, then of course slave labor, the Africans who were brought in, and then Chinese, and then of course the Indians as well. So a great mixture in some ways of these things. So as England turned towards the Caribbean and started building its plantations and empires and took to indentured servitude, of course, as the laws of physics tell you, whatever goes out sometime, has to come back in. And England began to worry now about what was going to come back from the Caribbean to England. It wasn't just finished products. You were now getting mulattoes, Creoles, people of mixed race parentage who were going to come back to England. So this idea of of England as an imperial colony and of Englishness as a white British kind of personhood began to erode a little. People began to worry about it. There was great anxiety about what was coming back from the Caribbean. And this wasn't just about mixed parentage and racial intermixture. It was also about what in the 19th century was considered the very real pathological effects of the tropics. That if you went out to the tropics, you would come back a changed person. There were diseases waiting for you out there. And maybe we haven't changed that much because, sometimes we still think that. But there are diseases waiting for you out there which will change you, not just physically, but psychically, and in some ways will change your very identity of being English. Part of it is just, I guess, things that we think about even today. That if you go to live somewhere else for 6 months or 1 year, it will change your worldview. It will change who you are. It will change how you think. Or at least that's what we encourage our students to do, right? We send them off to study abroad, and we hope that it will expand their horizons in some great ways, and they won't just visit every McDonald's from here to China. So you hope, but no, there's hope and there's reality. So all of these things were there. So these, in some ways the questions aren't different, but their affects were different. So when we hope now that people will change, of course, if you live somewhere else, at that point in time in the 19th century, we're talking about the early 19th century, the fears were not just that it would change you as a person and your behavior, but that it would somehow change you almost at the genetic, molecular level, right? That it would change you from being English to somehow being mixed, to becoming Caribbean, to becoming African, to becoming Indian, right? And that, of course, would change the whole imperial enterprise. the whole imperial enterprise, because of course the imperial enterprise at its very basic level was built not just on the calculus of profit and loss, but on the assumption that a particular race had the right to colonize, right? Not just conquest, but to colonize. So the 19th century, you begin to see this, and you begin to see these fears, and you have many pamphlets, writings about what it means for Jamaica to exist as part of England, right? Why there was a dire need for a line to be drawn between what was England and what was the colony. And thus, the notion of subjecthood, right? So one could imagine that England was a big, imperial enterprise, a big imperial power, but all those who were imperial subjects were subjects and not citizens. And that's a very important distinction to make, right? That at one point in time, India, Kenya, the Caribbean, and many other countries were part of the British Empire, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the people in those countries had British citizenship, right? Which would in fact entail a very different kind of roster of rights, of enfranchisement, of property, and so on and so forth. So you really have the colonial subject in the early 19th century, and even till the late 19th century. And the subject doesn't in many ways interfere with British citizenship. But there is a fear that British citizens themselves are coming back changed from these colonies. So of course, where does literature come in? So even in the 19th century, if you think about such books, as I'm sure you're well aware, Jane Eyre. I hope some of you have heard of Jane Eyre. Yes? Great. Of course, that I asked this with great trepidation, because the other day I was teaching a class, and I was asking my students, we're talking about some example of famous people, etc. And there was a film we're watching, and somebody mentioned Martina Navratilova. And then I said to them, I said, you get the joke, right? Martina Navratilova, etc., etc. And it's about a mother who finds out, who thinks her daughter is gay, but she finally finds out her daughter's not gay, and then she says, well, there's nothing wrong with being gay, I cheered for Martina Navratilova just as much as the next person. And I was talking to my class and saying, well, you get the joke, right? And you understand why. And then I realized they were looking at me in a very blank manner. And I realized they did not know who Martina Navratilova was. And I haven't hit many huge thresholds of age myself, but Martina Navratilova, it shook me. It shook me about what context we were living in, what it meant to not have a group of 25 students, not from somewhere where newspapers or TVs or access to these things are not available, but in the United States, in Boston, at Brandeis. I had no idea who Martina Navratilova was. And, to be fair, I said to them, to be fair, maybe I don't listen to Justin Bieber, but I do know who he is. So, so that's why when I said, you do know what Jane Eyre is all about. It wasn't really a joke. There was a great trepidation in my heart when I said this. In any case, to come back to this, so Jane Eyre. We all, of course, know Jane Eyre. It's text, not only a literary text, but it's a cinematic text in many ways. It's also a text on which many other texts have been built. Many other stories, many other films have been built using Jane Eyre as a basis. And of course, one of the most famous aspects of Jane Eyre is the mad woman in the attic, right? Bertha in the attic, whom we never really see, whom we never really hear in a kind of lucid way. I mean, we sometimes hear her screaming in the novel. We sometimes know that she said crazy things, but there is no lucid, articulation there for Bertha. And we know, of course, who Bertha is. Bertha is a mulatto, and she's married to Rochester because she comes with a fortune, right? And she's of mixed race. And her madness, her craziness is attributed to that mixed parentage, that she comes from the Caribbean, she's a mixed race, and of course, she's just, she's high color enough that the blackness or the Indianness or whatever the mixed parentage is kind of a recessive part of her, so that she's white enough for her to have been married to a white lord, who marries her, of course, also for the fortune that she brings. But we know that she's crazy. And the novel takes great pains to tell us that she's crazy and she destroys his life, and then, of course, Jane's, and we all know what happens. And in the end, there's this great conflagration. It's like a pyrotechnic ending. The house goes up in flames. And it's very interesting because at the time at which this was written, one of the sensational things that England would have been talking about would have been the burning of Indian widows as satis in India. So a reading public, reading Jane Eyre in England, would not just have been reading this for the British story, they would have been reading this for the Caribbean story and for the Indian story of sati. Right? So what we think of often as these very canonical core British texts of literature are in fact even very early on, 200 years ago, already being reinvented, almost rechurned in ways to reflect a reality that is far more complex than simply, English people sitting in their wonderful lawns sipping tea. For that, instance. So thinking of Downton Abbey, some of us know Downton Abbey, right? I unashamedly admit I am an addict. I watch and I rewatch. And at some points I'm wondering, why am I watching this? They're really spoilt people. And some of their stuff I can't quite understand, but it really sucks you in. And even in Downton Abbey, and I noticed, and I'm bringing this up because it was part of your syllabus as you've gone through the course. There's been a talk on Downton Abbey as well. And in Downton Abbey, you see, even though it's Downton, but what really gets us into the story is that it's the story of a family, but it's also the story of a nation. The world wars and what is going on. And oftentimes, young suitors will come to the house who have made their fortune in India, or whose uncles are in India, or who have been to the Caribbean, etc. So even something as intrinsic as that, as intrinsically British as Downton Abbey, right? If you start looking at what it means to be English and who is English in that, that Englishness is bolstered and reinvented through these various intersecting trajectories that come from the Caribbean, from India, from Africa, and even from the Americas. That's the 19th century for us. And as in Downton Abbey, the 19th century doesn't stay for long. The 20th century arrives with its own sets of trials and tribulations, of which the two greatest that we know of are World War I and World War II. Now, it might surprise you to know that of all the nations engaged in World War I and World War II, besides the people who died in the Holocaust and soldiers, Russia lost the maximum number of troops in World War II. You can take a guess to which country lost after Russia? What's the second country? India. When I always tell my students, when in doubt, when I ask you a question about numbers, by default, it's India. We win, of course, by numbers and the fact that I'm giving this lecture. So I control the statistics here. But truly, it's the people, the troops. My grandfather fought in the North African front in World War II. And we had nothing to do, per se, with World War II. But again, so World War II, even when it comes to World War I, when it comes to Downton Abbey, and as World War II comes to England later, we think of this as, in some ways, European wars. We know about the Pacific Front, we know about Japan, etc., but still, the world wars remain in our imagination as European wars. But the reality, if you start breaking this down, is far more complex. Right? It's far more complex. Even just as a personal example, one grandfather fought in the North African campaign. My grandmother walked from Burma to India for 4 months in 1942 when the Japanese attacked Burma. So, if you just think about when people talk to me about World War II, I always think about this and say, well, it's very interesting because you might not think about it, but it's also my war. And the reality of it is far more complex than just the European story. So, even when we think of how World War I and then World War II, and by the way, if you're a World War I buff, I can't recommend enough the Pat Barker trilogy. I don't know if any of you read Pat Barker or not, but the Pat Barker trilogy on World War I, which follows in some ways the travails of the poet Siegfried Sassoon, a Jewish poet, of course, who is a soldier at that time in World War I, it's a remarkable trilogy and a wonderful reading experience. I feel like sometimes I have to make that distinction because not everything that's remarkable is wonderful to read, but this is both. And I heartily recommend it. So the two world wars happen, and the two world wars change, again, what it means to be British, right? So England is involved, of course, in this international war with many other people, with many other countries, and many people have heard about, the World War I, about how the Polish cavalry, marched out against the German tanks, and were, of course, decimated. But again, another part of the story is also that hundreds of thousands of horses and cavalry were also exported from India, and what was then, of course, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, all one India, and also died, and were also destroyed during this time. So World War I begins to change, and you see this in Downton Abbey. You begin to see how social structure changes within that one house with the war coming in. Servants are beginning to think about who they can be besides being servants, right? The life of service is no longer just the only life. People in Downton Abbey, the daughters are marrying people of various class, heritage, etc. And that's changing what it means to be from the aristocratic classes in England after World War I. So this notion of who is English and what is English, right, resides, as we begin to see little and little in this sense of, what language you speak and what you look like, and more on a kind of Englishness as a particular national identity. And that national identity, I propose, is not something that's natural and default and a priori, that it is constructed, that it emerges in conjunction with and often in response to these various historical moments in British history and in world history. Then, of course, World War II happens, and Winston Churchill is presiding over the proceedings, so to speak. And Winston Churchill comes in and says, I haven't become Prime Minister of Her Majesty's government to watch the empire fritter away. But unfortunately for them, World War II does it, right? I mean, India credits Gandhi, of course, with the non-aligned move, with the passive resistance and the non-violent movement. But in many ways, the Indian struggle for independence, I think, could not have succeeded in some ways if World War II had not happened. World War II, in many ways, sets the stage for what happens here. And of course, Winston Churchill is trying to keep the British Empire together after World War II, but England is bankrupt. England no longer has the money. In fact, its colonies have bankrolled World War II. Taxes are levied in Africa, Caribbean, and in India to pay for World War II. And England simply cannot hold on to these colonies in the same ways. So when Indian independence takes place, the African independence, Kenya gets independence in the 60s, so on and so forth, Sri Lanka in the 50s and more. But when Indian independence takes place in 1947, it is a moment for India, but it is as much a moment for England, right? It's changing what it means to be English, what it means to be a colonial power, which England can no longer be defined as such. Of course, being colonial powers is also greatly eroded by the Holocaust, Because after all, what does it mean to go to war, to prevent a genocide, to prevent a Holocaust against it, to protect a people, while at the same time having colonies around the world which follow many of the same policies? So England no longer has the legitimacy left to, in many ways, to hold on to the empire. So of course, decolonization happens. These many countries become independent. But does this mean that England is simply divested of its diversity, that people just kind of fritter away and go back to their colonies? No, in fact, people come to England in greater numbers than they had before. Because now they are coming not as colonial subjects, but as post-colonial citizens. And so immigration, in fact, to England rises after independence of India, after the breakdown of the English Empire, than it actually had before. In fact, colonization, British imperial policies kept Indians, Africans, and Caribbeans very much in their own countries. People often came back as servants. Queen Victoria had a very, I don't know, some of you may have known about this, there's a new book about Queen Victoria and her Indian servant, whom she turned to for solace, some say, after the death of King Albert. But Queen Victoria had servants. She also had British Indian wards. So people, when the Punjab kingdom of Ranjit Singh, the Punjab kingdom was taken over by the British in 1839, his youngest son was adopted by Queen Victoria. You'll really like this story. So he was about 11 and he was adopted by Queen Victoria, and I know why this will be of great interest to you also. At that time, he had in his possession the Kohinoor diamond. Okay? He was adopted by Queen Victoria. Have any of you seen the Kohinoor diamond? Yeah. So of course it's now in the British, the royal crown. But in the Indian pictures and Indian paintings of old, it's about this big. It's a fist, and then it's cut down to fit, etc., and to reveal its great beauty. But he had in his possession at that time the Kohinoor diamond, and so Victoria adopted him, and he became a ward of the state. And the Kohinoor diamond was kind of hers as by right. Of course, when he turned 16, many people pointed out to Queen Victoria that it didn't look really nice for the Kohinoor to be in the royal crown because it still felt like loot. Right? So the British Crown devised a wonderful new strategy for how to acquire the Kohinoor. The diamond, the son of this last king, his own name is Bhupinder, but you don't need to know that. So the son was given the diamond. It was given back to him. And he was told that it would be a really nice gesture if he now gave it of his own free will to his mother, Queen Victoria. So actually then the Kohinoor, and in his own writings, in his own biography, King Bhupinder says, he says, for a moment I stood there, he was 16 years old, and this diamond was given to me, and I had this urge to just chuck it into the gutter out of the window. And he says, but I knew these things couldn't be done. And of course then he freely gives it to Queen Victoria. And in fact, you may not know this, but it's still the legal premise on which England holds on to the Kohinoor. So as a lot of the loot from the Holocaust is being returned and repatriated, many times India has asked and said, well, it's kind of interesting. Wouldn't it would be a gesture of goodwill if you just, once again, freely gave back the Kohinoor. But when it comes to legality, the legal premise stands because it's not loot, it wasn't colonialization, it wasn't looted in any way, it was freely given by a ward of Queen Victoria. So many of these things that we consider so canonical, so British, so part of the British crown, right, have these histories and have these stories that really make us think, what it means to be British. When the British crown holds in its place of prominence, the Kohinoor diamond. And of course, to make injury, to add insult to injury, the first time I was a student, I was in England, And I went to the Tower of London to see this. I was actually hoping more to see kind of the ghoulish aspects of the tower, but of course I couldn't not see the jewels. So of course I paid money. I went in and I saw this. And then what do I see? Here's the Kohinoor, and then there's a little thing that says, and this is the kind of Indian bracelet in which it might have been worn. And I said, okay, this is finally it. I'm never again paying money to see the Kohinoor diamond, because not only has it now been legally given, now I'm paying money to see this. But in any case, it's a canonical part of the British experience. If you go to England, if you go to London and you go to the Tower of London, you go to see the royal jewels. And of course, the Kohinoor diamond is in a prominent space there. So the 19th century and British Empire, and then the 20th century and after decolonization, what it means to be British, of course, is changed by this experience of colonialism, but now it's also being changed by the experience of immigration, right? Now you have Indians, Africans, people from the Caribbean, Jamaicans, Trinidadians, right? People from Kenya, Nigeria, many other places coming to England now for employment and opportunity. The post-colonial states have not really fulfilled all their promises. They haven't actually been able to offer employment and a standard of living in many ways that is actually accessible to all its citizens. So immigration to England after 1947 has come at an unprecedented rate. And for the longest time, England did have very generous policies of immigration for its Commonwealth citizens, people who were from the Commonwealth, the once colonized English Empire. So when these people began to come to England, so of course at first many of the old colonial demarcations still stood. If you were Indian, you lived here. If you were, Jamaican, you lived here. If you were from Trinidad, you lived there. If you're Nigerian, you lived here. If you go to London often and go to many of the ethnic neighborhoods for good food or for a different kind of cultural vibe now, the fact is that these neighborhoods were the first ghettos of these various populations. And we see these ghettos now in the moment of globalization and a kind of, also with the European Union coming in, taking on these cultural identities of ethnic hotspots, of having great ethnic food, of having great restaurants, of having great shopping, etc. But the histories of these places, and if some of you have read Monica Ali's Brick Lane, right, and the Brick Lane area of East London now is, it's one of the new thriving areas of London with great restaurants, art galleries, and more. But the history of Brick Lane, the history of East London, is not one of culture. It is one of immigration and of being ghettoized. By the way, this might again be of interest to you. Do you know the origin of the word ghetto? Any idea? Sorry? Iron foundry. Actually, from Italian, from Venice, right? The areas in which the Jews lived. The areas in Venice where the Jews lived were called the ghettos. And they had particular timings for when the Jews could leave, when they could come back, where they could be and not. And so that word actually comes from the Jewish experience, the ghetto, and which is, of course, now in the American context become various different things. But I thought this might be of interest to you. So, after independence in 1947, in the latter part of the 20th century, immigration changes what it means to be British. Of course, immigration changes what it means to be politically British as well, because until now, the usual demarcations of the Liberals and the Tories changes by their own take and standing on immigrants. So in the in the early parts, in the 1960s and 70s, Enoch Powell has his Rivers of Blood speech where he talks about how we must take to the streets and take back the country from these brown people who have come in, the Africans, the Trinidadian, the Caribbean, and the Indians. And the 70s and 80s are a really fraught moment in British history when it comes to race. It's not a comfortable time in the 70s and 80s to be in England and to be not white. And this has great fallout at that point in time. But slowly and steadily, it's changing what it means to be British. And literature, British literature, has a lot to do with this. Now, you might ask, why literature? Why focus on literature here? Well, the short answer, of course, is that it's my field of scholarship. But the long answer is that I want to suggest that in the case of the English especially, maybe not for everybody, but in the case of the English especially, literature is an important subject contributing to a sense of Englishness. Many of us, right, are the very foundations of what we call literature in English, come from England, right? It's literature in English, and I'm not saying literature, all literature, but literature in English as we understand it has its beginnings in England. Of course, this literature is then sustained and reinvented and changed by the immigrant experience and by formerly colonized subjects writing in Africa, Caribbean, and in India, right? So that now what we know of as literature in English is no longer simply British, right? Literature in English is also American, it's also British, it's Canadian, it's Trinidadian, it's African, it's Jamaican, it's Kenyan, it's Nigerian, it's Australian, it's Indian, Pakistani, Sri Lankan, Bangladeshi, etc. So why literature? Because literature in many ways is an integral component of British identity, or what it means to be English. Many of us think about this, and when we think about what it means to be English, certain canonical British texts come to mind. If it isn't Jane Eyre, then it's Vanity Fair, or it's Keats, or if you're poetically inclined, it's, maybe the Romantics, it's Keats, maybe it's Wordsworth. So again, as an aside, I don't know if you know this, but if you study in India in a school where the medium of instruction is English, you know your Wordsworth, and you know your Keats. You may know the worst poems, but you still know them. And you don't know how many generations of Indian kids have stood up and said, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats high over vales and hills. All at once I saw a cloud, host of golden daffodils, except that none of us knew what daffodils were, right? But at one point, and this sense of, and I say this not just as a statement about growing up in India, but about what it means to be English, because during this early part of colonization in the 19th century, what it meant to be English was also to be colonial. Who you were and how you acted in the colonies contributed greatly to what it meant to be English here. So if you think about Thackeray's Vanity Fair, the fortunes are in England. You see the people are rich and wonderful in England, but the fortunes are all being made elsewhere, right? Pickles and cashmere scarves are everywhere. And if you've seen the particularly lush, but probably not so good film, Vanity Fair, the recent one made by Meera Nair, you'd see that she's paid great attention to those kinds of details. Again, by the way, another piece of errata, but which I think is wonderful to know. So when we think of these canonical, wonderful English stories like Sense and Sensibility, say, or Vanity Fair, you now have the last Sense and Sense version of cinematic Sense and Sensibility was directed, of course, by Ang Lee, right? A Chinese director. Vanity Fair was directed by Meera Nair, an Indian director, right? So even now, as we speak, this whole notion of what is English and how we understand English sensibilities is no longer simply coming out of well, closeted is maybe not the right word, but I don't know, a closed sense of what it means to be white or British or English in some uncomplicated way. So back to this. So if you think about English literature and why it's important, of course, English literature was one of the great ambassadors of Englishness in the world. Even in the colonies, children were brought up on English literature. In the colonies, if you were learned, it meant that you could speak English and that you could recite English poetry and write it, for sure, right? Many of the great writers of the 19th century were writing of their experiences in the colonial lands. When Xanadu, in Xanadu did Kublai Khan a Golden Dome decree, Xanadu and Kublai Khan, all of these are colonial constructs, right? All of these. Opium, the great inspirer, the great inspiration of the 19th century in some ways. Don't look shocked. Almost all the poets of the 19th century knew their opium very well. Opium came from China and from India. And of course, the Opium Wars were fought over its trade. So all of these things, and you think about it, what is English literature? And English literature, even then, it's defining what it means to be British, but it's also defining what it means to be English outside of England. And of course, the colonial experience is defining it. If you read 19th century literature of any kind, especially when it's set in India, first of all, it always begins in May, when it's so hot, 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 hot. I've vowed if I ever write a novel, it will begin in winter. Not this kind of winter, the winter you see in India, in the north. But it always begins in the hot, hot, hot months of May. And if an Englishman falls in love with an Indian woman, you can take it from me, guaranteed, she will die. She must. Because, of course, if he falls in love with an Indian woman, they have children, then that's a very direct threat to the British Empire, right? What does it mean for these mixed-race children? They might be children of a lord, but will they inherit his lordship? So Downton Abbey gets a whole new twist, right, if Lady Mary marries an Indian prince. So this whole notion of 19th century colonial identity and British identity is very much engaged with what it means to be British outside of England, not simply within England. And of course, after World War II, immigration changes that, because now what it means to be English is also what it means, it also entails your opinion and your take on immigration, right? Because if it means that you are English and these are immigrants, then what is British citizenship? We're talking here about two kinds of notions of Englishness. Englishness as a cultural, traditional value, and being English as a product of modern secular nationhood, right? So if you're a British citizen, does that mean that you are English? That's the question on which this entire talk is being built, right? What does it mean to be English, and what does it mean to be a British citizen? Because, of course, in the 20th century, as the colonial empire breaks down, we're now faced with thinking about Englishness and British citizenship with this increased immigration. And this is really where you begin to see writers who are not English writing in English, defining what it means to be English at home and abroad. As the poet, the Irish poet Seamus Heaney once said, he says, England gave us English, but we taught them how to use it. So you now have writers like, of course, the granddaddy of them all, V.S. Naipaul, of course, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2002. Naipaul comes in, of course. Naipaul is, and I start with Naipaul not only because he's the oldest, and we always pay due respect to age in India, but also because he is in many ways a true product of the colonial trajectory. Naipaul's great-grandfather was an indentured servant who was sent from India to Trinidad. He settled in Trinidad, and of course, Naipaul was 3 generations later. And then Naipaul, a product of indentured servitude in Trinidad, moves at the age of 18. He gets, I think, a Rhodes Scholarship. He gets a Rhodes Scholarship and goes from from Trinidad to Oxford, and never goes back to Trinidad again. He goes from Trinidad to Oxford and never goes back to Trinidad again. He spends the rest of his life in England, becomes a British citizen, and then, of course, writes, almost 24 books, half of them fiction and the other half travel writing, essays, and more. And he's in very frail state now, so I feel badly if I say anything horrible about him. But some of his politics people are not very happy with. I'm one of them. But there's no doing battle with the fact that he is one of the great masters of the English language. If you think about, the great craftsmen of writing in English left anymore. He is one of the true masters. If you think of Henry James, if you think of others like him, then Naipaul is one of those last great masters. I mean, his mastery over the language and what he writes there's no going around it. It is fantastic. And he has written some wonderful novels, which I heartily suggest. One of them, of course, is In a Free State. It's on your handout. It's the book that won his first Booker for him. And it's a wonderful tale about decolonization and what it means to be in a free state, right? What it means for this interaction between the the British state and these decolonizing moments. So, of course, Naipaul starts writing, and he is, of course, now Sir Vidya Naipaul. He has been knighted. So if you think of knighthood as a core British quality, or I mean, if you can't get any more English than that you are knighted, that you're Sir someone, well, he's Sir Vidya Naipaul, and he is, of course, the product of indentured servants who were taken from India to Trinidad, who then won a Rhodes Scholarship and came to Oxford, who's a staunch and devout Hindu yet, who has an Indian name, who has great amounts of Indian subjects and people and characters in his books, but he is a British citizen, and he is Sir Vidya Naipaul. It gives a little twist to what we think about as Englishness in the present moment. Because Englishness, to many of us, if you say, what's English? Well, the Queen, and now Kate Middleton, some people say she's having twins, so of course it's the next big news of the century. So, the royalty, tea, which we can argue over. You can call it Englishness, or I would say, come on now. It's part of it. By the way, early this morning, listening to NPR, did anybody listen to this little take on tea in Ireland in the 19th century? Right? There was a little thing on tea in the 19th century that, when you think about tea as this core British thing, they do tea well, though, you give them that. You think this core British thing, these nice little porcelain cups and some savories with it, some salty, some sweet, and you sit down and you have a very civilized cup of tea. But in the 19th century, lower class working women were being told that sitting around and having tea was the same as having whiskey. Right, that it led to indulgence, to indolence, that it was bad behavior, that it fostered a kind of henship, that women would sit together and have tea like men in a pub, and they shouldn't be, aspiring for those same kinds of things. So there were pamphlets and great amounts of literature in Ireland in the 19th century urging working class women not to have tea. It was addictive. It asked you to have leisure. You sat around, you drank it, you were relaxed. What kind of things were these? You're working class Irish women in Ireland. Do not think about leisure and other things. Also, of course, the last thing that was considered particularly vile about tea drinking for working class women in Ireland in the 19th century was that it led them to talk. And then when women talked to each other, God knows what kinds of things would come out. So, in some ways their fears are not unfounded, because I guess it was many groups of women having tea together that finally got women the vote. But in any case, so we think these core kinds of questions. So, on the one hand, we can talk about Britishness as, if you think Scottish, then of course good whiskies, and if you think here, other primes, and if you're, by the way, prone to liking your whiskeys, it might be of interest to you that now some single malts are actually, God forbid, being produced in India. Because, and in fact, the largest consumption of whiskey in the world, by numbers again, my friends, is in India. We have a great many things, and we have a great consumption of whiskey. I will tell you, I was a student at Oxford, and I, at one of my first breaks, decided, I'd seen my father drink his scotch every evening and have his wax at great length about his single malt, so on and so forth. So I felt that I had to make this pilgrimage. I had to go to Edinburgh and go to the Whiskey Museum. And I was at that, I think I was 19, and of course I went, and then in England you can drink. At 19, and of course they give you these little free samples. And they said, would you try taste this? And I said, of course. And 2, and 3, and 4. And then, and I had no idea that you couldn't just keep sipping, that amount and do 20 of those. And I sat outside the Whiskey Museum and with my backpack and my head in my hands, and this really kindly old Scotsman came by and he looked at me and he said, Whiskey Museum? He knew. But, and of course, at other times traveling in Ireland and in Scotland, many times I've kindly strangers, usually gentlemen, have bought me drinks and said, when I've offered to pay, etc., they've said, are you kidding me, Singh? You're from India. The British have screwed us all. The drinks on the house. And I found this great affinity that, I could go to Ireland and I could go to Scotland and suddenly, we'd all be friends. But, things aren't that as easy as that. In any ways, right, these histories, right, really change. If you begin to think about it, these histories change what we think of as English and what it means to be English and how Englishness is constructed. So, of course, you have V.S. Naipaul. But then you have also writers like the Japanese writer Kusao Ishiguro, Remains of the Day, which was made into a fantastic film with Anthony Hopkins. But the book is really wonderful as well. Now, Ishiguro, of course, is of Japanese ancestry and then became a British citizen. And of course, Remains of the Day is considered a British book. And it can't get any more British than that. It's about a butler, right? Before Downton Abbey, folks, it's about a butler and his life and what happens. And it was, of course, written by a Japanese British writer. So what we think of as again, these notions of what it means to be English, what kinds of things are English, begin to change as we look at literature. If you think about, Zadie Smith, White Teeth came about. Zadie Smith, again, is of mixed Caribbean, white British, and Indian parentage. And Zadie Smith's book, White Teeth, came out to rave reviews, and it was a wonderful take on, again, working class Caribbean, African, and South Asian families and the interaction between them. And Zadie Smith is now, of course, a British writer. She now lives in the United States, I'm told, but she is, she is considered a British writer. If you think about Brick Lane, which some of you may have read, others may not. Brick Lane is about a Bangladeshi family, right? And about a recent Bangladeshi woman who comes from Bangladesh after she's married to England and her life there. But Monica Ali herself, of mixed British and Bangladeshi parentage, is a British writer. And the book is English as anything can be. You think again about Salman Rushdie. Everybody's familiar with him. Salman Rushdie's own life after the fatwa was issued against him, it was the British state that afforded him protection to millions of dollars because he was a British citizen at that point in time. He won the Booker as well. So all of these people, and they're considered British writers. They're considered, so that's the other part of our take on politics and on literature these days, that, these writers like Monica Ali, writers like Salman Rushdie are considered as much Indian writers as they are British writers. And that has something to say about what we think of as being English in this present moment of the 21st century, right? Where now it's no longer if you're an immigrant, once colonized subject, British, of mixed parentage, etc., but about how you tend to talk about yourself, right? Often many of these writers will come up and say, oh, well, I live in New York, London, and New Delhi, right? So you're American, you're British, and you're Indian as well. So this idea of who is English in the 21st century, is, of course, it resides very much on British tradition and British history, but I'm offering to you that history and that tradition is as much a construct. It's as contrived, and it's constantly being reinvented. It's not monolithic, it doesn't stay, it's not reified, it's constantly being reinvented with every given new political, cultural moment. the Booker Prize, when we talk about the Booker Prize in the last 10-some years has been won by Naipaul, by Rushdie, by Kiran Desai, by Arvind Aditya, White Tiger, by Arundhati Roy. All of these are writers of non-English heritage, right? And the Booker itself is now being won more by people outside of England than it is by people inside of England. Okay, the Booker is, of course, open to people of the Commonwealth writing in English. So it's very interesting to see that the Booker Prize, this grand bastion of English literariness, is, of course, being won, in the last decade or so more by non-white, non-English, so to speak, writers writing from around the world than it is by British writers within. Now, many people will say it's not just a factor of culture, it's also economics. The reading public and the reading markets are increasingly outside of England. You can get 50% of the British reading market and it will not match 10% of the Indian reading market. Once again, numbers, right? It's not just all a product of culture and tradition. It has a lot to do with the changed economies of our world, right? Being globalized means many different things. It just doesn't mean that the world is at our fingertips. It means that it's a very different moment on how to understand the world, right? So we think about these many things. I want to end with the last sort of personal experience. Some of you may have read, of course, Keats's poem called Lord Elgin's Marbles, right? He goes to the British Museum and sees Lord Elgin's marble and then writes this poem about it. So, of course, as a child, I knew the poem by heart, and I said, one of the things on your literary pilgrimage must go see the Elgin marbles. And dutifully, I took my Keats, sat there and looked at the Elgin marbles, watched them. I'm sorry to report no great inspiration came to me, but I felt like the inspiration had already been sucked out of it. After Keats, what else can you do? How can you follow up? How can you follow Keats? But I looked at this. Then in recent years, when the Olympics were to be held in Greece, the Elgin marbles once again came into the limelight because, of course, the Elgin marbles are so named because they were taken from Greece by Lord Elgin, right? And brought and put in the British Museum. And during the time of the Olympics in Greece, Greece wanted the Elgin marbles back. And I'm sure some kind of legal stuff happened. They never went back. They're still there, I have to report. Of course, the last twist to this story is, of course, Lord Elgin was one of the viceroys to India. And my family, they're a bit of a mongrel bunch themselves, but half of them come from the mountains of northern India. We're Himachali, we come from Himachal. And I was born at 14,000 feet. And I kept thinking that means I'll always have this great resistance to altitude. It doesn't last. But my family comes from the north, and for many, many years on family vacations, I had gone up to parts of Himachal in one of the great areas called an area called Dharamsala, where I don't know. Have any of you read MMK's Far Pavilions? Yes, some. So there's the princess keeps talking about the Dur Khaima, the far pavilions, the mountains that she sees off. She's of course referring to the Dhauladhar range, which is in western Himachal Pradesh. In any case, I'd been going to this area for many, many years, and there was of course a British cemetery, as there are many around India, and we would often go there, read. It was also always something of interest I would do with my father oftentimes. Look at the names, the dates, who is this, who is that, is somebody we know here, do I know any of these people from history? And I had been going for over a decade to Lord Elgin's grave. He is the only viceroy to have ever been buried in India. All other viceroys, went back or were shipped back and were buried in England. He's the only viceroy to have ever been buried in India. And I had been hanging around his grave ever since I was a child, and seen this huge towering, because of course he was a viceroy, so he didn't just get a little stone, he got a monument. And I kept thinking about it, and for the first time after many years, when I realized that here I was looking at Lord Elgin, or what remains of him, and I thought of what my own trajectory of what it meant to be Indian for me which had everything to do with what it meant to be British as well, right? Here I was at Lord Elgin's grave, but I had also been sitting at Lord Elgin's marbles, which I had no idea were from Greece. I had no idea then who Lord Elgin was. I only knew because I had read Keats, right? And so this notion of who is English for me, right, is not in any ways a closed question. I think I have only, what I have attempted today is to give you some sense of how one may think about it differently. But it is in no way a done deal. This is not the last word on it. I'm sure many, many new divisions and many new derivatives of what it means to be English in the 21st century will arise. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for questions.
Back to Downton Abbey. How would you place Art Malik's character in the 20th century? Because he's not upstairs and he's
I'm
not
sorry,
downstairs.
Could you say that again? People are walking, I couldn't hear.
Back to Downton Abbey. How do you place Art Malik's character in the 20th century? He's not upstairs and he's not downstairs. What will become of him? What will his place be?
Remind me again, who's Art Malik? What is his character?
He was brought. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of another character. I'm in upstairs downtown.
Okay.
The mother has brought this Indian person to be her secretary. We are now in the 20th century. What will become of a person like him who is neither upstairs or downstairs?
Right, absolutely. Now, I don't know that series very well. I mean, I know Downton Abbey, but in any case,
This is upstairs, downstairs.
right? I don't know it, but I can tell you, because it is not an isolated thing. Many Indians were brought in. So as a secretary, he's not the servant class, right? He's a kind of educated class, but as an Indian, he doesn't really fit into the aristocracy or even into the class divisions of being English. And this was not an unknown phenomenon, and this is also why the Indians were taken to the other colonies as indentured servants, because unlike the Africans and the Caribbean, Indians were educated by the British to be able to serve in British governance in India. So they served as a buffer class. So in fact, where he would be is a kind of buffer class. So many times Indian indentured servants were taken to Africa and the Caribbean to serve as a kind of buffer class between the Africans, who were now free, but in the British imaginary were still savages, right? Versus the Indians who had been schooled to a certain extent within the British system. So I think a character like that, this idea of the secretary, he would not have to be either downstairs or upstairs. He would in fact have his own category, which would be that of the colonial subject, right?
Americans, as a nation of immigrants, have a very complex identities.
Can you just raise your hand? I don't know where you are. Oh, sorry.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Please speak.
Say, Americans have very complex identities because we're a nation of immigrants, and our solution is to have hyphenated categories. So we have Asian Americans, we have African Americans. So my question is, I never hear about hyphenated names in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
It's either British or something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering whether Britain will ever evolve to having sort of honoring the two identities on an equal basis rather than having to decide if you're British or not.
Well, I mean, it's the interesting part, of course, is that for the longest time they have had British, but then what you have as another category is the Black British. So you have British, but Black British, and everybody, Indians, Africans, Caribbean, everybody kind of fits under the Black British umbrella. So that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that used to be the catch-all phrase, British and Black British. But that's changing more and more. But yet I don't think that they have still reached in any ways the kind of demarcations we have in this country. Asian American or African American, which is of course of interest because those are derivative categories, but we still have American. So we do have a default American, and then an Asian American, and then an African American, and so it is on the one hand a claiming of ethnic, cultural, and other identities, but it is also a particular kind of hierarchy and a particular kind of demarcation that is not without its own internal logic.
There's another category of European Americans who are people now commonly used for people of European descent. So, that's another.
No, it is true, of course. But that's understood. It's by default, right? That we haven't had that as part of the cultural narrative yet. Yeah. I see you waiting for the mic.
I might have two questions. It all comes out of this book.
I can multitask.
A lesser
I have a
book,
3-year-old.
a lesser book that I read recently, The Last Stand of Major Pettigrew by Helen Simonson. Really wraps up everything that you're talking about. And I just have I think I have two questions. First, this whole fear of terrorism is affecting, from what I can see in this novel as well as in the news, this so-called camaraderie that you're depicting here, that particularly the Pakistani colonists, are really getting hostile reactions and not really are being excluded, from this thing called being British. So I just feel that that's a whole new thing that you might, if you could comment on that. And then the other question kind of is, I got the impression that though the Americans and the Indians both got their independence from Britain, the Americans are really less, they're, at least through the literature, are less assimilated into this this thing that you're describing as being British. Why is it that the American independence really separated us, whereas the Indian, it doesn't seem to? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
No, it makes sense. I'm not sure that I can answer this in 3 minutes. So first of all, the question of terrorism, of course, I've tried to collapse a lot into an hour and 15 minutes. If we had another hour, we could now go into how 9/11 has changed these trajectories of how cultural identity is being defined. 9/11 has changed cultural identities in the United States, leave alone in England. So that's a whole other thing. But people like Mohsin Hamid, who wrote, he's the author of The Reluctant Fundamentalist, if some of you have read that. It's been now made into a film by Mira Nair as well. And Mohsin Hamid is of Pakistani heritage. He came to the United States as a student, worked here, but then after 9/11 went to live in England, took on British citizenship, but now lives in Lahore in Pakistan. And he wrote this book called The Reluctant Fundamentalist, which in many ways is a discussion of this figure of what we may understand as the terrorist. But in that book, he really uses what for us in the media oftentimes is the figure of a terrorist, which is usually a jihadi, illiterate, orthodox, backward, unthinking in some ways, to give us instead the fundamentalist or the radical as, say, the dissident citizen, right? The disenchanted immigrant, or the discriminated against person of color. So there's a lot of literature about this, and I absolutely agree with you that a lot has changed, and 9/11 has greatly changed how we may think of these cultural identities. But I think 9/11 has also, in some ways, marked off the United States from Europe in those ways, because even though some of these fears of who the terrorist is, whether it's the Paki or the other Muslim men have in many ways spread all over Europe and in fact all over South Asia as well. But Europeans tend to understand 9/11 and what had happened as a particular kind of American phenomenon, right? And they really kind of make a distinction because they talk about how they think of multiculturalism, race, and Muslims and terrorists as very different from how Americans may think about it. And they will draw a distinction here. So surely it has changed. About the second question, which I'm not sure I can answer very quickly, but of course the trajectories are very different. The trajectories are very different, but I think you have to keep in mind the time as well. American independence comes in 1776. Indian independence comes in 1947. We still have people living in India who remember being colonial subjects, right? Who have actual experience of colonialism. That's not true for the United States anymore. So we're really looking at very different chronological and historical trajectories. Also, the cultural foundations of India and India's experience of colonialism are very different from that of the United States, right? I mean, the United States were not a colony in the same way as India was. Now, if the United States, if the Native Americans had thrown up, and if the African American slaves had somehow managed to get together, form a government, and throw all Europeans out, that would have been a very different kind of trajectory. So I don't think the two cases can actually be put together in this comparative framework. I think they deserve acknowledgement and consideration together, but I don't think they can be spoken of in the same framework. There's someone, last person here.
So we see how England has embraced English literature written by so-called non-English origin peoples. But can you comment on how about in the rest of society, like elected politics, whether regionally or nationally, or socially with intermarriage, how are people of color that are English citizens being elected? Are they represented well in political positions? And what about the Indian origin person or Caribbean who comes, guess who's coming to dinner kind of thing? Are you able to comment on that in England today?
Well, absolutely. Well, the British parliamentary system, first of all, for the longest time, being able to vote in England depended not on race, but on economic status. You actually had to be a taxpayer and you actually had to have property of a certain level before you could vote in England. So what we think of now as voting as some kind of universal enfranchisement was not the case in England, first of all. So, for the longest time, you were not excluded from British politics just because you were of different racial affiliation. You were excluded because you didn't have the economic status to vote. So with that as a premise, even in the 19th century, there were people of Indian heritage who were actually in British politics in the 19th century. And there have been lords also of Indian heritage, as Sir Vidya, but there have also been lords Sir, I forget his name, Lord Paul, someone he is. But there are other people who have been raised to the peerage who are actually of Indian heritage in England. Of course, it's all of this goes without saying that all of these people who have been raised to peerage come with their own set of money, right? So they bring money to England before England gives them peerage. So it's worth thinking about that. So yeah, actually Indians have been, and people of color, not just Indians, but people of color have been a part of British politics, but it's not race that keeps them out, it's economic status. And in economic status, as you know, is a very effective weapon as well. So it's not necessary that they've always come in. There are more people in municipal corporations, city level, state level, that kind of government, and more are coming in. But it's still worth remembering that we think of Indians and Africans and others being very visible in England. Because in fact, most of us, our experience is of London or Edinburgh or Glasgow or one of the big cities of the area. The English countryside, the English rural area is still predominantly white, right? This phenomenon of multiculturalism, this phenomenon of many different people, rainbows, etc., and whatever other climatic things you can think of, is very much an urban phenomenon. This doesn't mean that it has spread to all of England. It's very much a metropolitan, cosmopolitan, urban phenomenon. And that's where you see the most political participation.
Thank you so much, Harleen.
Very welcome.
Thank you for coming.
Happy to be here.